Chiamika's soft giggles echoed faintly from her room down the hall. Richard frowned. It was past midnight. What could she possibly be doing awake? He rose quietly, careful not to disturb Florence, and padded down the hallway to his daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he peeked inside. Chiamika was sitting on the floor, her dolls arranged in a circle around her. She was laughing softly, her eyes fixed on a spot in the room that Richard's chest tightened. "You are dining and drinking with the dead." Richard blinked, confused. "What does that mean?" The dibia leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "Your wife and your daughter. They are not what you think they are." Richard strutted down the bustling streets of Port Harcourt, a place he felt was too small to contain his charm and ambition. He was a young man of 20, tall, with a smile that seemed to draw people in effortlessly. His confidence bordered on arrogance, a trait that had been with him since his teenage years. He thought of himself as irresistible, a man who could have any woman he wanted and discard her just as quickly. Richard's life was a cycle of fleeting pleasures and careless disregard for consequences. His friends often joked about his habits, but he wore it as a badge of honor. "Richard, you're like a shark," his friend Emeka had once said, laughing. "Once you catch sight of a woman, she doesn't stand a chance." Richard had laughed, nodding proudly. "A shark, he? Well, I'm just enjoying life. You know, live fast, love hard, leave no strings attached," he had replied with a wink. But to those who truly knew him, his so-called love life was a series of broken promises and hollow relationships. From his teenage years, he'd taken pride in his conquests. At 16, he had his first real relationship, though relationship was a generous term for what it actually was, a fling that lasted a few weeks before he grew bored and moved on. That relationship, like so many others, ended in tears. But that didn't matter to Richard. To him, women were like clothes, something to wear, admire, and discard. Years passed, and Richard's habits only deepened. By the time he reached university, his reputation had grown considerably. He was a senior now, with many juniors who admired his confidence and charm. He enjoyed the attention, often soaking in the admiration he received from women who didn't know his true nature. He would befriend them, charm them, and once they trusted him, he would find a reason to move on. One evening, Richard was sitting with his friend, Tunde, at a local bar near the university. The conversation was light, filled with laughter and idle gossip. But soon, Tunde shifted the conversation to Richard's romantic life. "So, Richie," Tunde said, leaning back in his chair, "when are you going to settle down? Or at least stop breaking hearts?" "My guy," Richard smirked, taking a long sip of his drink. "Settle down? You sound like my mother." "Tunde, why settle for one when I can have many? I'm still young, still having fun." Tunde raised an eyebrow. "Fun, hey? But don't you ever feel, I don't know, guilty? Some of those girls actually think you care." "Kay?" Richard chuckled, his tone dismissive. "Look, I never make any promises. If they fall for the charm, that's on them, not me." Tunde shook his head, slightly disapproving but still amused. "One day, Richard, this lifestyle will catch up with you. You can't treat people like that forever. Karma's real, you know." Richard shrugged, unconcerned. "Karma can wait. Besides, life's too short to be serious. I'd rather enjoy it while I can." Their conversation was interrupted as a group of young women walked by their table, one of them casting a shy glance in Richard's direction. He noticed immediately and gave her a quick wink, earning a giggle and a blush in return. Tunde rolled his eyes. "There you go again," he muttered. "Like a hawk spotting prey." Richard laughed, shrugging. "I can't help it if they find me charming." Richard's life had always been a game, a series of calculated moves designed to get what he wanted with the least effort. Women, to him, were predictable. But when Cynthia entered his life, everything began to shift in ways he didn't expect. It started one rainy afternoon in the university library. Richard was flipping through a book he wasn't really reading, his attention more on the women moving between the shelves. That's when he noticed her, Cynthia. She was sitting at a corner table, surrounded by thick textbooks and scribbling furiously in a notebook. Her dark, curly hair framed her focused face, and her serious demeanor intrigued him. She didn't seem like the kind of woman who would easily fall for his charm. Challenge accepted, he murmured to himself, flashing a self-assured smile as he approached her. "Hi," he said, leaning casually on her table. "Mind if I sit here?" Cynthia barely glanced at him. "Actually, I do. I'm studying," she replied, not looking up from her notes. Richard chuckled, undeterred. "Studying? That's a lot of books for one person. Are you writing a thesis or building a library?" This time, Cynthia looked up, her sharp eyes meeting his. "Some of us take our education seriously. Maybe you should try it sometime." Her tone was sharp, but there was a spark of amusement in her gaze. Richard felt a rush of excitement. She wasn't like the others who swooned at his first words. She was sharp, witty, and unwilling to entertain his nonsense. "You're tough," he said with a grin. "I like that. What's your name?" "Why do you need to know?" she shot back, though a small smile tugged at her lips. She was clearly enjoying the banter. "I'm Richard," he said, extending his hand. "And I'm persistent." Cynthia sighed, finally shaking his hand. "Cynthia, now, if you don't mind, I really do need to study." Richard left her alone after that, but not before noting where she liked to sit and the books she was using. Over the next week, he made a point to casually bump into her around campus. Sometimes in the library, sometimes at the cafe. Each time, he'd strike up a conversation, slowly wearing down her walls. It wasn't long before Cynthia began to warm to him. She started looking forward to their conversations, impressed by his humor and surprising intelligence. She was careful, though, keeping her guard up. "Richard," she said one evening as they walked through campus, "you're not like the others, are you?" He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "What do you mean?" "You're charming." "Too charming," she said, her tone teasing but with an undercurrent of caution. "Guys like you usually come with a warning sign." Richard laughed. "Maybe, but maybe I'm different with you." Over the next 6 months, their relationship blossomed. For the first time, Richard felt something more than attraction. He felt connected to her. But his old habits and selfishness lingered beneath the surface. Cynthia was serious about her dreams, and while he admired her, he couldn't see himself tied down. He liked her company, but he didn't think of their relationship as permanent. But Cynthia, unknowingly, held a card that would change everything. When she told him she was pregnant, Richard's world shifted. For the first time, he felt cornered. Her resolve to keep the baby and her determination to pursue her dreams afterward infuriated him. She was strong, confident, and uncompromising. She believed he could be better, but Richard saw her decision as a threat to his freedom. Richard sat in his room, staring blankly at the ceiling fan as it rotated lazily. Cynthia's words echoed in his mind. "Actress, I'm pregnant," and I'm keeping the baby." She had said it with such finality, such resolve, that it felt like a trap, one he hadn't anticipated. For years, Richard had lived life on his own terms, free of responsibility, free of accountability. But now, that freedom felt like it was slipping away. He tried to brush off the unease. "It's just a bump in the road," he muttered to himself, but deep down, he knew this was different. Cynthia wasn't like the other women he had been with. She wasn't going to quietly disappear. She was strong-willed and determined to make her own decisions, regardless of what he thought. And he hated that. Later that evening, Richard met up with his closest friend, Tunde, at their usual hangout spot near the campus. The small bar was dimly lit, its air thick with the smell of fried food and cheap beer. Tunde immediately noticed the tension in Richard's face. "Richie, you look like someone stole your playbook. What's up?" Tunde asked, sipping his drink. Richard hesitated, unsure whether to share his predicament. But eventually, the weight of it became too much. "Cynthia's pregnant," he said flatly. Tunde froze mid-sip, his eyes widening. "Wait. What? Pregnant? How?" Richard shot him a withering look. "How do you think, genius?" Tunde leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Wow. So, what's the plan?" "That's the problem," Richard replied, running a hand through his hair. "She's keeping it. Says she's not going to let it stop her from finishing school." Tunde frowned. "Well, that's admirable, I guess. But what about you? Are you ready for this?" Richard scoffed. "Of course not. I'm 27, man. I'm just getting my life together. I don't need a kid tying me down right now." Tunde raised an eyebrow. "So, what are you going to do?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He stared into his drink, his mind racing. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I can't let this happen." Over the next 2 days, Richard's mind spiraled into darker thoughts. He couldn't see a way out that didn't involve drastic action. He didn't want to be a father. He didn't want to lose his freedom. And most of all, he didn't want to be tied to Cynthia forever. Then, an idea came to him, one that made his stomach churn but seemed like the easiest solution. He would make the problem disappear. Not Cynthia, but the baby. "It's just a pregnancy," he rationalized to himself. "She'll get over it, and we can both move on." He spent hours researching ways to terminate a pregnancy without Cynthia knowing. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a pill that could induce a miscarriage if ingested. It was risky, but he convinced himself it was his only option. The plan began to take shape. He would invite Cynthia over, act supportive, and offer her a drink laced with the pill. She wouldn't suspect a thing. 2 days later, Richard called Cynthia. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and cheerful. "Can you come over? I've been thinking about what you said, and I think we need to talk." Cynthia hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure? I don't want to pressure you into anything." "Of course I'm sure," Richard replied smoothly. "I want to be there for you and the baby. Let's figure this out together." Cynthia felt a wave of relief. Maybe Richard was finally coming around. "Okay," she said. "I'll be there in an hour." She noticed he had tidied up his apartment, and there was even a plate of biscuits and 2 glasses of apple juice when Cynthia arrived. Richard greeted her with a smile and a warm hug. "End the table. This looks nice," she said, sitting down. "You've really thought this through, huh?" Richard chuckled, sitting across from her. "Of course. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized that I want to support you. We'll figure this out." Cynthia's face lit up with hope. "That means so much to me, Richard. I was so scared you'd push me away." "Never," he lied, handing her the glass of juice. "Here, drink up. Let's toast to figuring things out." Cynthia smiled, taking the glass. To figuring things out, she echoed, clinking her glass against his. She took a long sip, the sweetness of the juice masking the bitterness of his plan. They talked for hours about her plans for the future, how she would balance motherhood and her studies, and how she believed in their ability to make it work. Richard nodded along, playing the role of the supportive partner while silently counting down the hours. Later that night, after Cynthia left, Richard sat alone in his apartment. He felt a pang of guilt but quickly buried it. "It's for the best," he told himself. "She'll thank me one day." But deep down, a shadow of unease began to creep into his mind. A shadow he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to justify his actions. Unbeknownst to him, his decision would mark the beginning of a nightmare he could never have foreseen. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Cynthia's small hostel room, casting warm light over the scattered books and clothes that filled the space. She stretched and yawned, preparing for another day of lectures and assignments. Her thoughts were unusually light that morning. The conversation with Richard 2 nights ago had left her feeling hopeful for the first time since she discovered her pregnancy. He seemed willing to support her, and for Cynthia, that made all the difference. But as she stood to get ready, a sharp pain suddenly shot through her stomach. She clutched her abdomen, a gasp escaping her lips. For a moment, she thought it was just hunger or fatigue from the stress of juggling her studies with the pregnancy. She dismissed it and continued with her morning routine. By the time her roommate, Joy, returned from the bathroom, Cynthia was seated on her bed, her face pale, beads of sweat dotting her forehead. "Cynthia, are you okay?" Joy asked, concerned. Cynthia tried to wave her off. "I'm fine. Just a little stomach upset. It'll pass." Joy wasn't convinced. "You don't look fine. Should we go to the clinic?" Cynthia shook her head, trying to push through the pain. "No, it's probably nothing serious. I have a lecture in an hour. I'll feel better after some rest." But the pain didn't subside. Instead, it grew worse, becoming a relentless ache that left her doubled over. By the time she and Joy were halfway to their lecture hall, Cynthia couldn't take another step. "Cynthia, you're scaring me," Joy exclaimed. "We're going to the clinic. Now." The university clinic was a small, modest building, often crowded with students seeking treatment for everything from the flu to minor injuries. Joy helped Cynthia onto a chair in the waiting area, explaining her symptoms to the nurse on duty. Cynthia winced as another wave of pain shot through her, this one so intense it left her breathless. "She's pregnant," Joy added in a hushed tone, hoping the nurse would take the matter seriously. The nurse's face shifted with concern, and she immediately called for a doctor. Cynthia was led into an examination room, clutching her stomach as Joy followed close behind. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, asked Cynthia a series of questions while conducting a preliminary examination. "When did the pain start?" he asked. "This morning," Cynthia replied weakly. "It's been getting worse." "Have you eaten or drunk anything unusual recently?" he pressed. Cynthia shook her head, but then hesitated, remembering the apple juice Richard had given her. "Well, I had some juice 2 nights ago. That's all." The doctor frowned but didn't comment. He ordered a few tests, and Cynthia was asked to lie down while they waited for the results. By this time, her condition was worsening rapidly. Her breathing became shallow, her skin clammy, and her pulse faint. Joy stayed by Cynthia's side, holding her hand as she groaned in pain. "You'll be okay, Cynthia," Joy whispered, though fear was evident in her voice. "The doctor will fix this." Cynthia nodded weakly, her eyes glassy. "I just want it to stop," she murmured. But minutes later, her body convulsed, and the doctor rushed back into the room. "We need to act quickly," he said to the nurse, his tone urgent. "She's going into shock." Joy was ushered out of the room as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize Cynthia. She paced outside the door, tears streaming down her face, praying silently for her friend to pull through. Inside the room, Cynthia's condition was deteriorating faster than anyone expected. The doctor's efforts to save her were in vain. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became labored, and soon, the life that had burned so brightly in her began to fade. As the clock struck noon, Cynthia took her final breath. Joy was the first to hear the news. The doctor emerged from the room, his face heavy with regret. "She didn't make it," he said softly. Joy's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto a nearby bench, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of the loss was unbearable. Cynthia had been her closest friend, her confidant, and now she was gone. News of Cynthia's death spread quickly across campus, leaving a wave of shock and grief in its wake. Students gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the tragedy. Many remembered her as a bright, hard-working student with a promising future. Her death felt cruel and senseless. In her department, professors and classmates were left stunned. Some suspected complications from her pregnancy, while others speculated about stress or an undiagnosed condition. No one suspected foul play, no one except for Joy, who couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. "She was fine 2 days ago," Joy said to another friend. "She wasn't even sick. How does someone just die like that?" Meanwhile, Richard received the news through a mutual friend. He was sitting in his car when the call came. "Richard, have you heard?" The voice on the other end said, trembling. "Cynthia is gone." Richard froze, his mind refusing to process the words. "What do you mean, gone?" "She died this morning. At the clinic. Something about complications with the pregnancy." His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, Richard felt genuine fear. He ended the call, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Guilt clawed at him, but he quickly shoved it down. "It's not my fault," he told himself repeatedly. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But deep down, he knew the truth. The pill he had laced into the apple juice was the catalyst for Cynthia's death. He had taken a life he had once claimed to care about, and there was no undoing it. That night, Richard sat alone in his apartment, haunted by Cynthia's face. Her laughter, her warmth, and her unwavering determination replayed in his mind like a broken record. For the first time, his reckless actions felt like chains around his neck, dragging him down into a pit of despair. 5 years had passed since Cynthia's death, but for Richard, the memory lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. On the surface, he seemed to have moved on. He had completed his studies, built a small but thriving business, and even found love again. Yet, beneath the facade of success, guilt gnawed at him, a silent predator that refused to let him rest. One quiet evening, Richard sat in his office, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of him with his wife, Florence, and their daughter, Chiamaka. They looked happy, perfect, even, but the smile on Richard's face in the photograph felt hollow. His thoughts drifted back to the first time he met Florence. It was at a national youth service camp. Florence was vivacious, kind-hearted, and full of life. She reminded him of Cynthia in some ways, though he didn't dare admit that to himself. Perhaps that was why he was drawn to her. Florence had a warmth that made him feel, even if just briefly, like he could leave his past behind and start anew. After their service year, they stayed in touch, and their relationship quickly blossomed. Within a year, they were married, and soon after, they welcomed their daughter, Chiamaka. The name, meaning God is beautiful, felt like a symbol of the fresh start Richard so desperately craved. For a while, life seemed perfect. His business flourished, Florence proved to be a supportive partner, and Chiamaka brought joy to their home. But Richard could never fully shake the feeling that he didn't deserve this happiness. He often woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, Cynthia's face looming in his dreams. One night, after tucking Chiamaka into bed, Richard joined Florence in the living room. She was watching television, her laughter filling the air as she enjoyed a comedy show. Richard sat beside her, feeling a pang of envy at how carefree she seemed. "Florence," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She turned to him, concerned. "What is it?" He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "Do you ever think about the choices we make in life? About how they might come back to us?" Florence frowned, turning off the TV. "That's an odd question. What's on your mind?" "Nothing," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just something I read earlier." Florence studied him for a moment, but eventually shrugged. "Well, I think as long as we live honestly and treat people well, there's nothing to fear." Her words hit him like a knife. Live honestly. It was the one thing he hadn't done. Things began to change when Chiamaka turned 7. It started subtly, small setbacks in his business, delays in projects, unexpected losses. Richard brushed them off as bad luck. But then the misfortunes grew. A fire broke out in his warehouse, destroying valuable goods. His car was involved in a near-fatal accident. Somehow, he emerged unscathed, but the vehicle was beyond repair. His once thriving business crumbled, and with it, his sense of control. He became irritable and withdrawn, spending long hours brooding in his office. But what unsettled him most was the behavior of Florence and Chiamaka. As his life fell apart, they seemed unaffected, almost indifferent. Florence continued to laugh and enjoy herself, while Chiamaka played happily, oblivious to her father's growing despair. As the days passed, Richard's sense of unease grew. He began having vivid nightmares of Cynthia, her face pale and tear-streaked, accusing him of betrayal. In one dream, she stood in his living room, holding a child that should have been theirs. Her voice echoed in his mind, a haunting whisper, "You took everything from me." He woke up gasping, his heart pounding. But what unnerved him most was the sound of laughter coming from the hallway outside his room. He opened the door to find Chiamaka playing with her dolls, completely unfazed by his distress. "Daddy, why are you sweating?" she asked innocently, tilting her head. I'm fine," he stammered, closing the door quickly. But he wasn't fine. He was beginning to feel like a stranger in his own home. One day, Richard confided in his friend Charles, the only person he felt he could trust. Charles listened intently as Richard poured out his fears and frustrations. "Charles, something is wrong," Richard said, his voice trembling. "Florence, Chiamaka, they don't seem real. It's like they're not affected by anything. And I keep having these nightmares about Cynthia." Charles frowned. "Nightmares? About the girl from university?" "Yes," Richard admitted. "It's like she's trying to tell me something. Like she's haunting me." Charles hesitated before speaking. "Richard, this sounds serious. If you really believe something isn't right, you need to seek help. Maybe talk to someone who understands these things." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, confused. "A spiritual healer," Charles said cautiously. "A dibia. They can see things we can't." Richard scoffed at the idea but paused when he saw the sincerity in Charles's eyes. "You really believe that could help?" "I do," Charles said firmly. "And I'll go with you, if you want." Richard hesitated, torn between skepticism and desperation. But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore the growing dread inside him. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Okay, let's go." The night air was thick and heavy as Richard lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The once comforting silence of his home now felt oppressive, filled with the weight of unspoken words and unseen forces. His wife, Florence, was asleep beside him, her breathing steady and calm. Yet, her presence felt alien to him, as though the woman he had married no longer existed. Chiamika's soft giggles echoed faintly from her room down the hall. Richard frowned. It was past midnight. What could she possibly be doing awake? He rose quietly, careful not to disturb Florence, and padded down the hallway to his daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he peeked inside. Chiamika was sitting on the floor, her dolls arranged in a circle around her. She was laughing softly, her eyes fixed on a spot in the room that seemed empty to Richard. But the way she stared, so intently, so fixedly, sent chills down his spine. "Chiamika," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him with a smile, her innocent face illuminated by the dim glow of her bedside lamp. "Daddy, I'm playing with my friends." "Your friends?" Richard asked, stepping into the room. His eyes darted around, finding nothing but the lifeless dolls. "There's no one here." Chiamika giggled, as if he had just said the silliest thing. "You can't see them, Daddy, but they're here. They like to play with me." Richard's heart thudded in his chest. "Who are they, Chiamika?" She shrugged nonchalantly. "Auntie Cynthia comes sometimes. She's very nice." Richard froze, his blood running cold. What did you say?" "Auntie Cynthia," Chiamika repeated, her voice light and cheerful. "She said you know her." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "Go to bed," he said sharply, his voice trembling. "No more playing. Now." Chiamika frowned, but obeyed, climbing into bed. As Richard closed the door, his hands shook uncontrollably. He stumbled back to his room, his mind racing. How could Chiamika know about Cynthia? He had never spoken of her to anyone, least of all his 7-year-old daughter. The following days brought no relief. If anything, the strange occurrences in the house grew more frequent. Richard often caught Florence and Chiamika sharing secret smiles, as if they were part of some unspoken joke he wasn't privy to. The sound of whispers filled the house at odd hours, though he could never locate their source. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, he heard Florence and Chiamika laughing in the kitchen. Their laughter wasn't warm or familiar. It was eerie, almost mocking. He stormed into the kitchen, his frustration boiling over. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Florence turned to him, her expression calm but her eyes cold. "We're just having dinner, Richard. Is that a problem?" "It feels like everything is a problem lately," he snapped. "You laugh, you eat, you carry on as if nothing's wrong, while everything in my life is falling apart." Florence's calm facade cracked slightly, her gaze narrowing. "Maybe if you stopped looking for someone to blame, you'd figure out why." Her words hit him like a slap. He stared at her, trying to decipher the meaning behind them, but she offered nothing more. She turned back to Chiamika, cutting a slice of yam and placing it on her plate as if their conversation hadn't happened. That night, Richard lay in bed, his mind replaying Florence's cryptic words. He couldn't shake the feeling that she and Chiamika knew something he didn't, something about Cynthia, about his past, about why his life had started crumbling. When sleep finally claimed him, the nightmares returned. This time, Cynthia's voice was louder, angrier. He saw her face, pale and lifeless, her eyes fixed on him with a mix of sorrow and rage. "You can't escape me, Richard," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "You took everything from me." He woke up with a start, gasping for air, the sheets drenched in sweat. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of footsteps outside his door. He opened it quickly, but the hallway was empty. "Cynthia," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" For the first time, Richard felt truly helpless. The shadows that had followed him for years were no longer hidden. They were closing in. Richard paced the length of his living room, his frustration mounting with every passing second. His life was unraveling before his eyes, and the people he expected to support him, his wife and daughter, seemed indifferent to his suffering. Florence's cryptic comments and Chiamaka's eerie references to friends had unsettled him deeply. He was desperate for answers but felt like he was walking blindly into a storm. That evening, as Florence sat quietly at the dining table reading a magazine, Richard decided to confront her. "Florence," he began, his voice strained, "I need to talk to you." She looked up from the pages, her expression calm but devoid of warmth. "What is it, Richard?" Richard pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you even care about what's happening to me? Everything is falling apart. My business, my life, and you act like none of it matters." Florence placed the magazine down slowly, her gaze steady. "What do you expect me to do, Richard? Cry with you? Pity you? I expect you to support me," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You're my wife. I'm supposed to be able to lean on you, but instead, you're cold and distant. What's going on with you, Florence?" Her lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "What's going on with me? Maybe the question you should be asking is what's going on with you. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Richard shot back, his voice rising. Florence's expression darkened. She stood up slowly, placing both hands on the table as she leaned toward him. "Do you think you're the victim here, Richard? Do you think all of this, your crumbling business, your bad luck, is happening by chance? Maybe it's time you take a good, hard look at yourself." Richard's stomach churned. Her words felt like a veiled accusation, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more about his past than she let on. "Are you blaming me for all this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not blaming anyone," Florence replied, her tone icy. "I'm just saying that you reap what you sow. Maybe you should think about the seeds you've planted." The room fell silent, the tension between them almost palpable. Florence's words struck a chord in Richard, stirring memories he had long buried. Cynthia's face flashed in his mind, her laughter, her anger, and her lifeless body lying on a clinic bed. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they clung to him like a shadow. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't helping," he muttered, turning away from her. "Maybe it's time you figure out why your life is falling apart," Florence called after him, her voice cold and detached. Richard stormed out of the house, his mind racing. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Florence's words had cut deep, but they also left him with more questions than answers. As he wandered the streets of Port Harcourt that night, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Florence wasn't just being cruel, she was hiding something. Her behavior, Chiamaka's eerie comments, and the strange occurrences in his home were all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. By the time he returned home, it was late. The house was dark and quiet, and for the first time, it didn't feel like his home anymore. It felt foreign, almost hostile, like it was watching him. He climbed into bed next to Florence, who was already asleep, her breathing steady and untroubled. Richard stared at the ceiling, his mind a storm of doubt and fear. "What seeds have I planted?" he thought to himself. "And more importantly, what's going to grow from them?" The air in the small village was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint smoke of wood fires. Richard sat uneasily in the backseat of Charles's car as they drove down a narrow dirt road. He had reluctantly agreed to visit the dibia after weeks of feeling trapped in a maze of misfortune and dread. Charles, his childhood friend, had insisted this was the only way to find answers. "I know you don't believe in these things, Richard," Charles said, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "But sometimes, the problems we face aren't ordinary. You've tried everything else, haven't you?" Richard nodded silently. He had seen business consultants, financial advisors, even doctors to address the strange physical exhaustion he had begun experiencing. None of it had worked. His life continued to spiral downward. Now, his last hope was a traditional healer, a man said to see beyond the physical world into the realm of the spiritual. They arrived at the dibia's compound just before sunset. The modest thatched hut stood in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine as they stepped out of the car. The atmosphere was unnervingly quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Charles led the way, greeting the dibia respectfully as they entered the hut. The room was dimly lit by a single kerosene lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls adorned with symbols and charms. The dibia, an elderly man with piercing eyes that seemed to see through Richard's soul, sat cross-legged on a mat. His presence was commanding despite his frail frame. "You seek answers," the dibia said without preamble, his voice deep and gravelly. "Yes," Richard replied hesitantly, sitting across from him. "My life. Everything is falling apart. I don't know why." The dibia stared at him for a long moment, his eyes unblinking. Then he closed his eyes and began to chant softly, swaying slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Richard felt the room grow colder, the air heavier, as though an unseen force had entered the space. After several minutes, the dibia opened his eyes, now filled with a strange intensity. "Your problems are not ordinary," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Richard's chest tighten. "You are dining and drinking with the dead." Richard blinked, confused. "What does that mean?" The dibia leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "Your wife and your daughter. They are not what you think they are." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice rising. "That's impossible." The dibia's expression remained calm but firm. "You carry the weight of a sin too great to ignore. A spirit has followed you, Richard, and she will not rest until her justice is served." Richard felt his stomach drop, his mind immediately flashing back to Cynthia. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." The dibia said nothing, only handing him a small bundle of charms. "You must protect yourself. The answers you seek will come, but they will not be easy to bear. Prepare yourself." As they drove back to the city, Richard was silent, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. Could it be true? Was Cynthia's spirit haunting him through Florence and Chiamica? He turned to Charles, his voice trembling. "Do you believe what he said?" Charles hesitated, then nodded. "Richard, I've known you for years, and I've never seen you like this. Whatever is happening to you, it's not normal. You need to take this seriously." The drive back to Port Harcourt was long and silent. Richard sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in thought. The dibia's words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. "Your wife and your daughter are not what you think they are." Each repetition made his chest tighten, the fear creeping deeper into his bones. Charles glanced at him occasionally, hesitant to break the silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful. "Richard, you've been quiet since we left. Are you okay?" Richard turned to him, his face pale and tense. "Okay? Charles, how am I supposed to be okay? The dibia basically told me I've been living with ghosts. My wife and my daughter. How is that even possible?" Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, Man. But what if he's right? Everything you've told me. Florence's coldness, Chiamica's strange behavior, your nightmares. It all lines up. Richard shook his head, his voice rising. No, it doesn't. Florence is my wife. Chiamica is my child. I was there when she was born. I held her in my arms. They can't be. His voice broke, the words too painful to say. Charles sighed, his tone firm but compassionate. Listen, I know this is hard to accept, but you have to face it. The dibia said there's a spirit tied to your past, and it's affecting your life now. You need to figure out what's really going on. By the time they reached Richard's home, it was late. The house was dark, and the silence inside felt heavier than usual. Richard hesitated at the door, his heart pounding. He felt as though he were walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now.